So, now we come to the second presentation by Carolin Ganz Vargas from the Free University of Berlin, also my alma mater, where I studied. She is an MA student in social and cultural anthropology, as I mentioned, at the Free University of Berlin, with a research focus on resistance, on hope, and future making. Goes all together very well within anti-colonial and anti-racist movements. Her work combines, we'll also see today, ethnographic and visual methods, and is situated in both Berlin and in Latin America. Welcome here, and we're looking forward to your presentation. Thank you.
Thank you for having me. So today I will talk about my current research that was conducted between September 2025 and March 2026 in the Dominican Republic. It is part of my investigation for my master thesis actually, and as you will also see, I'm still in the process of gathering and also analyzing all the material. So I hope also today to get some valuable feedback in this process. So I want to begin with a moment from my fieldwork that fundamentally shaped how I came to understand this research. So one afternoon I climbed up a loma, which is a mountain ridge overlooking the Pueblo Viejo mine, together with Mong, a local media activist who documents impacts of extraction in the region. And after a steep climb, we reached the top. From there, the landscape seemed divided in two. On one side, there was green mountains, a green that I had almost never seen in my life. Truly beautiful landscape. And on the other side, there were tailing dams and dust and smoke rising from the mine. Standing there, I was really struck by the scale of the transformation. For the first time, I could see not only the mine itself, but the broader landscape it was reshaping. As a Dominican German researcher whose family comes from a nearby region, this moment was also deeply personal. The mountains, rivers, and fertile land before me resembled the Dominican Republic that I had grown up knowing through my own childhood memories, but also from my mother's stories and memories. Looking across the valley, I felt a profound connection to the land and the generations of people who had lived from and with this land long before me. And at the same time, I was confronted with another reality. The Dominican Republic is often resembled as one of the places where colonial extraction in the Americas began. The region has long been shaped by histories of dispossession and unequal relations of power. Standing on the ridge, these histories felt no longer distant. The mine appeared not simply as a contemporary project, but as part of a much longer continuum of extraction. Standing there, I became aware of a tension that would run through the entirety of my fieldwork. While people spoke about mining and displacement, they were equally speaking about memory, belonging, and ways of life under threat. This raised a question that would come to guide this research. What happens when the future people long for increasingly resembles a past that is disappearing? So my fieldwork is based in Cotuí, a municipality in the province of Sanchez Ramirez in the central region of the Dominican Republic, as you can see on this upper map. The area is home to Pueblo Viejo, one of the most significant gold mining sites in the Americas, and a place whose history is deeply entangled with the history of colonial extraction in the Caribbean, in the sense of that it was one of the first gold mining sites. The name Pueblo Viejo literally means old village, and it refers to a colonial mining settlement established in the early decades following the Spanish invasion of the island of Haiti. The gold extraction in the region began in the late 15th century and formed part of some of the earliest extractive enterprises of the colonial period. During the last weeks of my research, I attended a lecture by the Dominican historian and cultural critique, Dr. Margarita Lila Rosa, on indigenous and maroon resistance in the Caribbean. Drawing on colonial records, she traced the central role of gold in the colonial project from its very inception. One account in particular stayed with me: Columbus's identification of nearby gold deposits after encountering an indigenous woman on the island of Haiti wearing gold ornaments. The story reveals how the pursuit of gold was intertwined from the outset with the exploitation of indigenous peoples, gendered violence, and appropriation of land. And I chose in specific this painting, this engraving by Theodore de Breyer, which was painted or published 100 years after Columbus's arriving. And I think it's not, we shouldn't see it as a historical painting, but more, or historically accurate painting, but more as the perception through which this very moment is also transmitted in time and also understood today. And I think it's in specifically the scenery of indigenous people handing Columbus like gold and accessories and ornaments really describes this moment that also Dr. Lila Rosa was talking about. So today, Pueblo Viejo is operated by the Canadian company Barrick Gold and the US-American company Newmont, though through this presentation I will mainly refer to Barrick Gold because they're the most present ones. It is among the largest gold mines in the world. Recent expansion plans, including the construction of a new tailings storage facility, the one you see here is the old one that, as you can see, is almost full, have generated significant opposition among surrounding communities. Residents have raised concerns regarding water contamination, environmental degradation, displacement, and the long-term consequences of extractive development. More than revealing a continuity of extraction, this historical perspective transformed how I understood the present. The conflict surrounding Pueblo Viejo appeared not as isolated disputes over mining, but as part of a longer history of dispossession, whose effects continue to shape how people imagine the future. So one of the most striking themes throughout my fieldwork was the recurring language of life and death. Throughout interviews, participants repeatedly recalled rivers where families gathered, landscapes that provided food and livelihoods, and forms of collective life deeply rooted in relationships to land and water. One participant, Nancy, described spending entire days sitting by the river, catching shrimp with her bare hands with relatives, before simply concluding, "Oye, un paraíso," listen, a paradise. These memories were often marked by grief, but what struck me was that they rarely emerged only as reflections on the past. They surfaced in conversations about the future. It was within this context that I repeatedly encountered the term el Triángulo de la Muerte, the Triangle of Death. The expression refers to the territory increasingly enclosed by mining infrastructure and tailing dams surrounding Pueblo Viejo. More than a geographical designation, it functions as a countermap produced by those living within the affected region. While official maps represent the area through concessions, infrastructure project, and developmental plans, as you could also see in the map I showed before, El Triángulo de la Muerte names the territory through its lived consequences. At the beginning, I assumed that the name referred primarily to environmental contamination and the health risks associated with mining. Yet, when I asked participants what exactly they meant by death, one participant replied to me, "If the tailing dams collapses, death. If the rivers are contaminated and people use that water, death." This is why we speak of death. And I also want to show you this very sequence that I filmed while eating lunch in somebody's house. And this is just one of the affected communities, and you have like the small street, and then you have these huge vehicles just passing through, and then security behind it, and then a bus with the people who will work on the site. And this just happens every day, at all times. It's really loud, which is really disturbing because it's a very peaceful, quiet location normally. Yeah. So, in that sense, death referred not only to illness or pollution, but the disappearance of rivers, forests, animals, agricultural livelihoods, and the social worlds that has historically sustained community life. So one story shared by Nancy that I mentioned before stayed also with me. During one of the protest camps organized to prevent further deforestation, community members relied on a nearby spring for drinking water and cooking. Nancy recalled how young people regularly fetched water from what she described as one of the cleanest water sources she had seen in years. Eventually, the area was militarized and access was blocked. She remembered pleading with soldiers to let her pass, explaining that they only wanted to collect water. Again and again, they refused, insisting that they were following orders from above. I think what makes the story particularly striking is that the river shown here in the video is the same river people were trying to protect only 7 months ago. So, throughout my fieldwork, I also witnessed an extraordinary persistence of collective action. In 2017, members of the Comité Nuevo Renacer, which is the first organization formed by affected community members, initiated the Encampamento de los Encadenados, the encampment of the enchained ones, chaining themselves at the entrance of Barrio Pueblo Viejo. What began as a symbolic protest evolved into a 7-month encampment. To be clear, that the chaining you see here, these people remained there 7 months enchained at the entrance of Barrio Gold. Then they were expelled from the land and moved on to a second camp that lasted roughly 2 more years. This protest in particular became one of the most important symbols of local resistance against the mine. And basically the sign says that 600 families are dying because of contamination, because of Barrio Gold. So, while participant observation and narrative interviews allowed me to understand how people experience the impacts of mining, I became increasingly interested in a different question. How do people imagine the future under conditions of ongoing uncertainty and loss? Conversations, again, return to contamination, displacement, and environmental destruction, while future aspirations often appeared fragmented, absent, or overshadowed by expressions of hopelessness. Yet, despite this, people continue to organize, resist, and imagine alternatives. This raised a broader question about the role of hope in sustaining collective struggle. Inspired by work on collaborative future scenarios, particularly Van Vost's efforts to create collective spaces for reflecting on possible futures, I developed a participatory visual and narrative method that I called Futuros Imaginados. Following each narrative interviews, participants were invited to respond to a simple question. Imagine a future in which you are able to decide over your land, your water, your crops, and your community. What would that future look like? Their responses were recorded on video and later edited into a short collective film in collaboration with a researcher from the Observatorio Dominicano de Políticas Públicas, with whom I worked closely throughout the fieldwork. The film became the basis for a collective workshop in which participants watched and discussed one another's future visions before engaging in a final collective exercise of imagining the future together. More than a method for generating data, Futuros Imaginados created a space in which future imaginaries became collectively audible and discussable. What emerged from these discussions was not simply the presence of hope, but the realization that the future itself had become contested political terrain. The future was often imagined through the preservation or restoration of relationships that participants felt were already under threat. This points towards one of the central tensions emerging from the research. The futures imagined by many participants are often treated as incompatible with development, yet they remain deeply meaningful to those who continue to defend them. Rather than expressing nostalgia, these visions reveal a refusal of a developmental trajectory that depends upon the destruction of the very conditions through which life has historically been sustained. The violence of this conflict lies precisely in the fact that one future can only advance by rendering another increasingly impossible. Listening back to my material, I became increasingly convinced that what is at stake in Cotuí is not simply a conflict over mining, rather about different actors struggling for fundamentally different futures. This became particularly apparent when comparing the futures imagined by community members with those promoted by the company and the state. Throughout its public communication, Barrick Gold presents itself as a driver of progress, sustainability, and development. The future promised by mining is one of modernization and prosperity. Mining appears as a pathway towards a better life for the whole country. Nuevo Horizonte is designated for the relocation of community members, and it embodies this very promise. Its very name, New Horizons, invokes the image of a better future. Yet, throughout my fieldwork, residents rarely or never referred to it by its official name. Instead, they spoke of El Desierto de la Muerte, the desert of death. Built on largely barren pasture land outside of the city of Cotuí, the settlement stands in stark contrast to the communities people are being asked to leave behind. The coexistence of these two names for the same place reveals a fundamental tension running through the conflict itself. What is presented as progress and opportunity by some is experienced by others as dispossession, isolation, and the loss of a way of life. A similar tension emerged in discussions about development more broadly. Participants frequently connected the expansion of mining to wider transformations taking place across the Dominican Republic. These processes were often discussed not as signs of national progress, but as evidence that decisions about the future of the country were increasingly being shaped through external interests and forms of dependency. Against this backdrop, participants articulated futures grounded in the continued possibility of living well within relationships and forms of belonging that extraction increasingly threatens to unravel. What struck me was that many of these aspirations are often treated as that they belong to the past. Participants were not simply longing for a lost world. Rather, they were questioning a developmental trajectory that requires the destruction of these relations in order to move forward. These questions extend far beyond Cotuí. Only a few weeks after I concluded my fieldwork, communities across the Dominican Republic mobilized against the proposed Gold Quest mining project in San Juan de la Maguana, another region in the Dominican Republic. Despite heavy state repression, sustained collective organizing succeeded in forcing the suspension of the project. These events reinforced a realization that had accompanied me throughout the fieldwork. The struggles unfolding in Cotuí are not isolated conflicts, but part of a broader contest over the future of the whole country. What I encountered in these communities was not only resistance to extraction, but a persistent capacity to imagine and defend alternative futures, even under conditions of profound uncertainty. Perhaps this is where the significance of these struggles ultimately lies. This reveals a central tension within contemporary development itself. As ways of life that many people regard as desirable futures are simultaneously treated as obstacles to progress. This makes the conflict surrounding Pueblo Viejo fundamentally a struggle over whose futures will be allowed to endure and who gets to decide about it.